A possible repeat of Hula. Activists say at least 80 people have been killed by Syrian government forces in Hama province. And as the reports spread, protests were held in the city of Aleppo. Western and Arab calls mount for a strong response to the Syrian crisis by the international community. This as Kofi Annan is due to report to the UN Security Council on his battered peace plan. And a high-stakes bond sale for Spain. It'll try to sell as much as €2 billion of bonds. More from our Madrid correspondent a little later. Hello and thanks very much for joining us here on France 24. I'm Claire Pryde. Also coming up, Amnesty International takes its arms trade treaty to galactic proportions. That and plenty more in Web News. We start with what appears to be a repeat of the Hula massacre. Activists say villagers near the city of Hama came under heavy bombardment before pro-government militiamen moved in, stabbing people, including women and children, and shooting at close range. They say at least 80 people were killed. The Syrian regime is once again blaming the violence on terrorists. Now here's our regional correspondent, Adam Platz.
It's very difficult for anybody to verify this information. And the original sources were the Syrian National Council, the Syrian opposition movement, plus Syrian expat organizations, and now there are activists on the ground talking to media organizations and to the world outside Syria. What is being claimed happened is a massacre took place anywhere between from the numbers that are being reported, which are somewhat conflicting, between high 40s and 100 people being killed in a village or an area called Mazrat al-Kabir, some 20 to 30 kilometers west of Hama. But what's really striking from the accounts of this instance is that if these claims are true, it very closely mirrors the Hula massacre. Insofar as what people are saying is that first this area was shelled, and following that Shabiha moved in and did a lot of the killing hand to hand at close range with knives and so on. And these Shabiha are irregular, ununiformed militias who are on Bashar Assad's side, and ever since the start the opposition has been saying that they've been carrying out a lot of the dirty work, as it were, to put down the uprising.
Now, those reports of a massacre in the Syrian province of Hama come as Russia criticised the Friends of Syria meetings the US and its partners have been having. It says there should be a broader international meeting. And later this Thursday, Kofi Annan is expected to report to the UN Security Council on his battered peace plan.
Foreign ministers gather in Istanbul to find a solution to the 15-month Syrian conflict. The United States wants to step up actions against Bashar al-Assad's regime. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is laying down the groundwork of a possible transition strategy. She said as much in Azerbaijan ahead of her arrival in Turkey.
It's time for all of us to turn our attention to an orderly transition of power in Syria. We will look for additional measures that we can take to pressure Assad and alleviate suffering.
Additional measures that could include UN sanctions. Meeting in Washington, the Friends of Syria group called on its member countries to impose sanctions in hopes of isolating and weakening Assad's government. But this is at odds with Russia, a key player as it's Syria's most important ally. Moscow is against sanctions and wants to continue diplomatic efforts while broadening who participates.
The goal of such a meeting is to agree honestly and without double standards to fulfill and support the Kofi Annan plan.
Russia hopes to bring Iran into the talks, an idea many in the West balk at.
This is a country that is supporting some of the unacceptable violence and supporting the Syrian regime in what it is doing to the Syrian people.
UN Arab League envoy Kofi Annan is to speak to the Security Council Thursday. He's expected to bring new proposals in hopes of reviving his peace plan.
And for more on this, I'm now joined by Ardavan Amir-Aslani. Hello and thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
You're a writer and geopolitics professor here in Paris. Now, first of all, let's talk about Russia. I mentioned a little bit earlier in the bulletin how they've been criticizing those Friends of Syria meetings. They want it to be broader, and they want Iran to have a seat at the table. What kind of support has Iran been giving already, and how do you think their participation would change the situation?
Iran is the key to the Syrian conflict. Iran is the principal ally of the Syrian regime. Iran gave the Assad Alawite regime its letters of courtesy in relation to their orthodoxy from a religious point of view. Iran is the main financial backer of the Syrian regime. Iran is the main supplier of arms. Iran is, by definition, the only massive support for Syria. No solution is possible within the framework of the current negotiations without the role of Iran. Iran is defending across the Middle East all of its Shiite allies, and Assad is the only dominant Shiite ally in any of the existing Arab countries around. So the Iranians are not going to let this regime just go away, in particular because it is because of the Iranian influence in Syria that Hezbollah, this large Lebanese movement, can survive. It's an existential issue for Hezbollah because tomorrow, if you have the Syrian opposition, which is exclusively Sunni, coming to power, Hezbollah would lose its main support line in relation to ammunition, in relation to financial support. It's going to be tough for them to survive if there's a regime change in Syria. And the Russians themselves, they're looking at this conflict and they're reminded of what happened to them in Libya, where an international resolution basically attempting to protect civilian populations ended up with a regime change mandate given. And both both Russia and China have within their own boundaries their own ethnic problems. The Russians in relation to the Chechen issue, the Chinese with the Muslim Uyghur people. And they know that they're involved in a conflict primarily with Sunni-backed movements. And what we're witnessing today in Syria is a religious war. It's a religious war between Shias and the Sunnis.
We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, you could say that this conflict has divided the international community. On the one hand, you've got countries like Russia and China, like you said, they strongly oppose any kind of foreign intervention. They are alongside Iran, if you like, on that issue. And on the other hand, you've got the US and the European powers and certain Arab countries. One of them, of course, is Qatar. And the Prime Minister of Qatar is in Paris at the moment. He'll be meeting later with the French President François Hollande. How do you explain the leading role that they've been taking in the anti-Assad movement?
Qatar and Saudi Arabia are the only Wahhabi countries in the Arabian Peninsula. Wahhabism is the most radical version of Sunni Islam. And what they're doing today, implementing their policies in Syria, is what they've been doing in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafist Al-Nur party, what they've been doing with Ennahda in Tunisia, and what they've been doing in Libya with the Benghazi Sunnite regime. These people, these regimes, are involved and engaged in a massive global war against what they perceive as a large threat for the entire Arab Sunni world. That is the rise of Iran. And rise of Iran is not only about Iran, it's about Iraq, which is another Arab country dominated by Iranian Shiite allies. It's about Syria. So in their mind, this conflict in Syria is a conflict about how to be able to emaciate the power of Iran, the rising star of Iran in the area. And the Iranians have understood this because they themselves are engaged in a similar combat in another country in the Persian Gulf, Bahrain, where the scenario is the exact opposite, where you have a Sunni minority government dominating a Shia population. So what you're witnessing over here is a conflict of civilizations, two versions of Islam trying to protect their respective allies. And when you talk about Friends of Syria, I don't think the term is right. You're talking about the Friends of the Syrian opposition that is exclusively comprised of Sunnis and allies of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. When you look at Syria, you're looking at a country that is divided into a large number and array of minorities.
I was going to ask you about that. What role are the other religious groups playing in all of this?
All of these people are profoundly scared because as far as the Christians are concerned, and they represent 12% of the population, they have in mind what happened to the Christian community in Iraq, where half of the entire Christian community was expelled of the country and the remaining are living in a state of constant fear. The Kurds in Syria, they also represent 2 million people. They always had in this Assad regime an ally in the combat for autonomy in Turkey and elsewhere, the Turkmens. So you've got all these ethnic and religious minorities in Syria that are looking with a great degree of fear at the opposition. Position that is, as I said, uniquely comprised of Sunnis. And Sunnis, what they're aspiring for is returning to their days of glory in the area, because prior to the Assad regime, this country and this area was dominated by the Ottoman Empire, which was Sunni, and by the Arab Empire at that time, which was also Sunni. The Shiites were not even recognized as valid citizens. They were not authorized to apply for positions in the army or in the bureaucracy. They are fighting for survival, while as the opposition is fighting for return to the days of glory. The motivation is not exactly the same.
All right, let's get back to the international community and what it's trying to do about the conflict in Syria. You've got, of course, Kofi Annan's peace plan, which obviously it seems you could say it's been shattered. Kofi Annan is going to be addressing the Security Council a little bit later on. He's expected to announce what he will call a contact group that would include Russia and China alongside what we've been calling the Friends of Syria. How do you think that can work? Do you think Kofi Annan can convince Russia and China to come on board?
I think the situation has changed today. If you've noticed, looking at the Russian attitude towards the Syrian conflict, from a rather moderate position, the Russian regime is becoming much more radicalized. Now, in competition with the Annan plan, they want to set up their own international conference. A week ago, one of the dignitaries of the Russian regime stated that they are not married forever with Assad. That position seems to change because Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of the Russian regime, recently proclaimed that it is out of the question to fight for any kind of a regime change in Syria. Russia is trying to reposition itself in the Middle East, and Syria is considered as a major pawn in this entire war scenario, because the fall of Syria will emaciate and weaken Iran, and Iran represents 12% of proven oil reserves, and is considered today by Russia as being the only non-US dominated oil reservoir on the planet. The Chinese are looking at it the same way. So these people are locking themselves behind the Assad regime because what they see is not a fundamental endeavor to keep a Shiite regime in power. It's about protecting their own interests in the area. That's what they're fighting for.
Okay, thank you so much for your expertise. Ardavan Amir-Aslani, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.